Hello, everyone. My name is Henry Hung Lu. I'm the Executive Director and Curator of Center A, Vancouver International Center for Contemporary Asian Art. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Center A is situated on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, on which we have the opportunity and honor to create, learn, and live. Unceded means that this land was never surrounded, relinquished, or handed over in any way. We recognize the indigenous communities who have been dispossessed from the homelands and territories upon which an institution was built and currently occupies and operates in. To acknowledge the traditional territories, to recognize the city and country's longer history predating Confederation, one where indigenous peoples have lived since time immemorial. We encourage you to reflect on the history of the land that you're watching. We're streaming today's talk from and the land caretakers. Located in Vancouver's Chinatown Center, also acknowledge and recognize the complex and multi-layered experiences of the individuals and communities who have lived, built, and contributed to the vibrancy of this historic neighborhood, and those who continue to do so today. Center A Vancouver International Center for Contemporary Asian Art is the only public art gallery in Canada dedicated to contemporary Asian and Asian diasporic perspectives and concerns. Since 1999, we are committed to providing a platform for engaging diverse communities through public access to the arts, creating mentorship opportunities for emerging artists and arts professionals, and stimulating critical dialogue through provocative exhibitions and innovative public programs that aim to complicate understandings of migrant experiences and diasporic communities. And Center A's programming has been rooted in a curiosity about an ongoing exploration and examination of what a contemporary Asian Art Center can do in the current times. And then today is an honor and delight to host this talk by Renée Sarojini Saklikar. And today's talk is presented as part of Center A's Speaker Series 2022, which started in May, and in conjunction with our inaugural arts writing mentorship program. And just a little bit about the mentorship program. We hosted 8 self-identifying Asian youth who are at different stages of their explorations of writing practice or career. And the 12-week program, we had mentors, for example, Alan Cho from the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, and then Bo Pache from Art Speak Gallery in Guesttown as the main mentors for our mentees. And we also had weekly guest speaker guest talks and throughout the 12-week program. And today's talk is extension of the series, and then it's such a pleasure to welcome Renée to be here with us today. And before I introduce Renée to everybody, I would like to, on behalf of Center, I would like to acknowledge the support of the BC Arts Council, and then also the Canada Council for the Arts for helping us realize the mentorship program and also the speaker series. So without further ado, let me introduce Renée to everybody. Renée Sarojini Saklikar is the author of 4 award-winning books, including Children of Air India and Listening to the Bees. She was the first poet laureate for the City of Surrey from 2015 to 2018. And Renée's newest book is Bramah and the Beggar Boy, an epic fantasy in verse, published by Nightwood Editions in 2021. And during today's talk, Renée Sarojini will discuss her approaches as to the epic fantasy in verse. The heart of this journey bears all patterns. And shortly, I will also share a link to the book's website, and I think it's Renée's website, and people can read more about it. There's really thoughtful and really kind of engaging texts that I cannot wait to read more about after today. And I would also like to quickly introduce Coco Zhou, Center A's library assistant. As you can see, Coco is currently in our amazing reading room. And Center A also house a big collection of rare Asian art books, and that really touch on different kind of categories and also types of materials, including exhibition catalogs, ephemera, critical texts, and it's really a wonderful source. And then, since we're talking about the reading room, just do a quick plug, which is that the Center A's gallery hours is Wednesday to Saturday, 12 to 6, and everyone is welcome to come into a gallery, not only see the exhibition, but also check out the library, because it's a really wonderful resource, even when I was a student myself, and when I first learned about Center A. So really, it's a wonderful spot to be. And then we have couches, and then so can comfortably do some reading. And so Coco today will sort of moderate will be a conversation with Renée, and at the end. And I would like to encourage everybody here today to also send in your questions either through the Q&A or the chat functions at the bottom of the screen, and then we will try to get to all of them if time allows. But also feel free to just send in questions during the presentation and the discussion as well, because we want it to be also a little bit more interactive. Yeah. And we also a special, very lastly, special shout out to our special project coordinator, Rochelle, Triana, and who has been very instrumental in coordinating the logistics and also making the talk happen. Anyway, so without further ado, I will give the floor to Renée, and again, thanks everybody for joining today. All right, I'm gonna go to the behind the scenes, and then I'll leave it to Renée, and then later Coco.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Henry, for such a fabulous introduction. Thank you, Coco. I've been thinking and contemplating about your incredibly thoughtful questions. I also want to give a shout out to everyone who's here. What a beautiful land acknowledgement. And I feel very honored to be doing this on a relatively hot, but not as hot Saturday morning. I'm going to ask for my slides. There's a wonderful tech person behind the scenes at Center A, Diane, to pull up those slides. And there we are. I'm going to just briefly give a little talk, and then I believe Coco and I will have a discussion, and hopefully that will spark some questions from all of you who are listening. So, fairy tales, legends, myths, reclaiming the epic. And you'll find that this idea of the prefix re, to reclaim, to restore, to revision, is very much, I'm beginning to see now that I've published book one of this massive project, this idea of to return, to restore, to revision keeps coming up, to rethink. So the photograph you see is from many, many years ago in the state of Gujarat, India being a republic like the United States. The provinces are called states. And my mother's side of the family is from the state of Gujarat. And this is a photograph of my auntie, now deceased, her courtyard. And she was a dairy farmer. and had a herd of buffalo that served her very well. And so the buffalo milk would be preserved in these incredible urns made of different materials, including copper and also glazed earthenware. And this idea of making, as we will see, comes up quite a bit in my philosophy of how I'm reclaiming the epic. So I think we'll go to the next slide. One afternoon, in an old house in an abandoned village on the outskirts of Perimeter, in the place they call Pacifica, Bramah and the beggar boy find fragments of an ancient text in an oak box. Hunched over scraps of parchment and broken computer disks, they blow the dust off a cover, and so our story begins. So that is from the opening of book 1 of this massive epic I've been working on for many years. And just a few things to help situate us about fairy tales, legends, myths, and I've called it epic emanations. At some point, and we're going to talk about this more as we go through the morning or the early afternoon, at some point, I realized that this type of storytelling about sagas and long epics with the fantastical was just part of my DNA. You know, I'm South Asian. I'll get into that in a moment, but you don't have to be South Asian. I think right now, sci-fi, spec fic, science fiction, fantasy, I mean, it's filling the bookshelves, it's selling. And I really wanted to enter that place. I didn't realize it when I first started, but I really wanted to enter that place. And this idea of perimeter, what's inside and outside, I'm going to be speaking of. Pacifica is a reimagined British Columbia, and I acknowledge that I'm an immigrant settler, and as the saying goes, uninvited, and that's so problematic, and how to figure that out. And I think we'll move on to the next slide, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And so all of that feeds into this, what I call this act of a literary reclamation. So again, there's that the prefix re, right? Finding space. So for those of you who are writers or contemplating writing, or artists or creatives or readers, this idea of how do we win space, even as we acknowledge the difficult things of our past and our present and definitely our future. So Henry graced us with a beautiful land acknowledgement. And I just want to say I'm here in East Vancouver, in the Joyce Collingwood area, which I love, and I want to acknowledge I'm on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. And the photograph is actually, you know, what I call ground zero of settler background for myself, which is Fraser View Cemetery in New Westminster overlooking the Fraser. And I remember growing up hearing stories that the colonial folks and the settlers who cleared the land and did a lot of backbreaking labor, even as they did all those other things that, you know, not as great. So there's always that dialectic between the good and the bad and in between. They deliberately had these vistas so that those coming up the river would get a sense of this is the site just below the penitentiary of law and order and control. And then, of course, where the dead are buried. And my dad, my dear beloved father, is buried here. So for me, a lot about being a creative in these times is how to creatively inhabit and not be erased within these complex contexts. And that is where this idea of legend and epic finds a place for space for reclaiming. And we'll go to the next slide. This is the tension, right? This is the great work. And so the themes, I think, this is sort of my summary slide, my theme slide, and then we'll go a little deeper in each of these. And here you see from that same cemetery, my father's gravestone. He died very suddenly, and I miss him terribly. And this phrase, "fare forward, voyagers," actually is a line from T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets. And my dad was very known for putting exclamations, like very classic Bombay English. He spoke with a strong South Asian accent, although he was a very brilliant man, a PhD and so on. But if you'd ever met him, you would know what I'm talking about. And this was one of our little, my sister and I we were just devastated by grief, but we put this little personal touch of the exclamation, which is in the poem, by T.S. Eliot. And you'll find it in my book as a saying, a futuristic saying of the time travelers in the book Bramah and the Beggar Boy. Fare forward, voyagers. So these literary forms that I explore are the epic and poetry. And I look at levels of language, very much thinking about subverting the center with the margins. So if you think of brown, Asian, uninvited settlers coming to this most colonial of places, having been born in India and then moving across Canada, and this idea of fare forward voyagers and how to insert oneself being on the margin into the center. You'll see that's a theme for my whole creative practice. And then using culture to torque, twist, undermine, reimagine. And there's that the return. So you'll find me hearkening back to those themes. And then putting the othered self, however that may be, into venerable traditions of myth-making. Anyone who's looked at the great myths will know that women, for instance, and others, we don't always find our place, although so much new scholarship is coming out about, in fact, what we thought were the classics as told to us by colonialists, by Victorians, by the sort of basic readers taught in grammar school. We're actually very wrong historically. And so it's about creating new legends and adapting the ancients for other, perhaps through gender, through sexual orientation, through race, through class. So we'll move on to the next slide. Oh, I think, yes. So I'm just going to go a little deeper into that because this idea of what is story and what is epic and how we relate to that. I was born in, as I mentioned, the city of Pune, which is known once as Pune, and English is my mother tongue. And tell you the truth, just being able to say that so freely now is liberating, because when I was growing up in British Columbia, when I went to UBC and I got my English Lit degree, at the beginning of most classes, just like we'll be doing shortly, I now teach at KPU and SFU and different places, the profs, almost always white men, would look up, they'd look up their glasses and they would ask me point blank, are you sure you're in the right class? And they couldn't believe how many times, even now, really, are you 100% Indian? And yeah, I really am. And where did you learn to speak English? These keep coming up, right? We're always having to renegotiate. So let the record show that my father came from a Hindu background, converted to Christianity, actually became a United Church minister. And my mother comes from a Sunni Muslim family and also converted to Christianity. And so all of that goes into my practice about how I want to do those things that I showed you in the previous slide of subverting, torquing, twisting, reimagining. And here are two touch points for me, and everyone has them, right? Tolkien looked, when he wrote The Hobbit, he looked at Scandinavian myth, and there's a Finnish myth whose name I can't pronounce that he looked at. There's Anglo-Saxon Beowulf and so on. And I've always been a bit sort of shy about just fully reclaiming, I've got these three major threads and I want to do something with them. And then also remembering that it isn't all about high culture. There's family gossip, there's stories, there's the unacknowledged, there's the illegitimate, there's the non-reliable. Those are the most fun stories of all. And that it's sort of built into my particular DNA, this love of the long, expansive tale of world building. And who knew, as my students started to tell me, get out of that literary world and get into the genre, spec fic, science fiction, fantasy, epic world. And they started to have an influence on me. So we'll go to the next slide. All of this pouring into this key slide here. This is a beautiful image of a bookmark that I picked up in Dublin, beautiful city, with some of my all-time favorite writers. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I adore these Irish gents, but you'll see something, right? You'll see what's missing from here. So it's like a little mnemonic for, I never saw myself reflected in any of the greats of literature, either modern or epic, from Beowulf to Beckett. And so this sense of the othered, of invisibility, became even more heightened because I'm older than a lot of young writers now. When I read fantasy and science fiction and spec fic, which the traditional canon of was so dominated by straight white men. So the importance of finding literary and genre mentors like Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin, Doris Lessing, Neil Hopkinson, and Margaret Lawrence. Reading The Diviners was life-changing for me, because even though she's not Indigenous, there were actually Indigenous people living a life in the books, as opposed to, say, bless her, Margaret Atwood and others. So we'll go on to the next slide. So this idea of how to claim space and the power of seeing yourself in literature. So for those, I think I'm one of the last presenters for Center A's fabulous mentorship program for writers. I really encourage writers and readers to seek out some of these alternatives. They're giants themselves of fantasy and epic literature. And what I have heard again and again from other writers, creators, whatever their background, is you cannot become what you cannot see. And so it becomes so important. Why reclaim legends? Why reclaim myths? Why reclaim these things? Because we cannot become what we cannot see. And this extends to ideas, not just identity. So we'll go on to the next slide, the idea of climate emergency, for instance. And so again, this is just a repeat. I wanted to show you a little bit about the practice that, well, what is English and what is language? And how does language languish in these great traditions? So how to welcome ourselves into the epic, that it's okay. I had to give myself, you can see from a bit of repetition here, I had to give myself a lot of permission that it was okay to place myself, we'll go to the next slide, on the pedestal of some of these greats. And so how do we think of the other when we look at what we're writing, in my case, in particular, the epic? And again, I mentioned this in my summary slide, but one of the things I feel that's been, until recently, and it's vastly changing now, it's like the world is catching up, maybe particularly because of the pandemic, that's been missing from the literature on climate change, is this idea of who is most impacted by climate change, and the way that class inequality and inequity really impact that. And so as creators, always asking, what's missing? What is there to add? And how does climate change affect everything we do? So we'll go to the next slide. So that figures into another key part of my practice and of the book I'm working on, the books, which is the micro-local as a site of research. And it's about reimagining. So again, the reimagining, repurposing, like crafters do, like makers do, what is worthy of an epic. Because so often when you think of the epic, you don't think of, well, our immediate surroundings, particularly if you live in like an East Side place. So this is our local community garden that my husband and I think he's listening, helped dig quite a few years ago. And this is our SkyTrain and the beautiful mural. This is standing east, looking west, that we're so grateful that we have public infrastructure in this time of trouble, of climate change and global inequality and wars and so on, that we have all this. And so I have tried to reimagine very specific micro-local places into the epic I'm writing, because they're worthy of being documented. So I see the creation of these long world-building sagas, even though it's fantasy and imagination and not real, as a form of documentation. Let's go to the next slide. So I'll just read a little to give you a little bit more flavor of this key idea, which is that language making is an act of resistance. And before I read, I just want to tell you what that image is with the hexagon, the bronze hexagon in the middle. It's a picture of steps from where I'm speaking to you from one of those water mains. It's Aberdeen and Foster, in case you want to find it. And you'll see it says the word water. Is that not just shade and water in the times that are coming? We feel them now, the wet and the dry and drought, shade and water, running water, public water. That becomes just fabulously important. So here's a little bit from the epic. Captured at the gates of one of the last autumn portals, And this is in the voice of the migrants, the refugees, the settlers, thrown together by catastrophic times, chained, we sang before, is also a place. Transport planes to buses, freight trains shunting, railway tracks bombed, rebuilt with old iron dry, pine cones fell, unrelenting and sad. Baghdad to Paris, east to west, reserve armies of labor, social unrest. The poorest families sick with fever, those who stood at the back of the line shared crusts of bread, telling tales of the before. We'll go to the next slide. So much of what I am writing in this mega saga, I'm working on book 2. It's hard. Book 1 is, as you have seen it and heard it, Bramah and the Beggar Boy, and then there are 6 books planned. May the muses be kind and may I survive to finish it. But all of it really is animated by what would happen if our accelerated climate change emergency gets even worse. This is one of our local parks, and it's Gaston Park, or is it? Yeah, it's Gaston Park. And it's at sundown, which I feel is a very powerful, that dusk threshold, the idea of time travel and portals. And it's taken recently, and you can see just parched white, the grass. It kills me to see the lack of green, and this is the world we're living in. Next slide. So what would happen if, yeah, we can go to the next slide. So you heard me read this classic, old-fashioned, dare I say it, Marxian terminology about reserve armies of labor, which is very prevalent, the concept of it, in my work. Well, who is inside and who is outside? Who are the workers? Who's displaced? Who are migrants? Who are refugees? Who are the bus riders? Who are the people who are care workers getting up at 4 a.m. in a pandemic to go look after people like my mother? This is so much part of the dystopia that's caught up to me. I often say, you know, I started this 10 years ago, and many of the things I was writing about seemed so far-fetched. As I was researching all these terrible things, and you know, the thing about masks and everything else seemed really far-fetched, and the world caught up with my imagination, sadly. So this is a picture that really speaks a lot to me. It's one of the few places where I live in the city that I can get a view of the Lions. And I walk up there, it's Lincoln Street, and it's woven into my poem. Next slide. So that idea of the shuttered view. And so I've been talking about this epic, this 10-year project, Thought JBAP, the heart of this journey bears all patterns. I love the way it plays out, right? And sounds Asian, Thought JBAP, like some Indian thing. And it's as Englishy as you can get. It's perfect iambic pentameter. Perfect, not in the sense that, oh, how great I am, but it's just a terminology of meter. It is 10 beats of iambic pentameter, weak, strong, weak, strong. The heart of this journey bears all patterns. And book 1 features Bramah, a time-traveling locksmith, her orphan apprentice, the beggar boy, and they used cunning and magic to outwit the evil consortium, a global mega corporation controlling all aspects of existence, even to the point of the weather. And they join with seed savers and outcasts in a world ravaged by climate change and global disorder. And it's all written in verse. So I think we can go to the next slide, which is just about the end. And that's the cover of this beautiful book, released during the pandemic. Local independent publisher Nightwood Editions. Gratitude to them. Gratitude to the artist Gibson Space, Nadina Tandy, who gifted me the hand imagery, but it's a composite of 2 of her paintings. And gratitude to local book designers, Top Shelf Creative. So in a pandemic, all of these creatives and people coming together under incredible odds. The people who supplied the paper, it's all recycled, certified organic. The artists, right? So when we talk about crafts making and what goes into it and what goes into a book, how crafts making was an act of hope, an act of resistance in the pandemic. And then I think there's one more slide that we can go to. Yeah, and so great gratitude to all of you for listening. I hope all these have been little seeds, these slides, little ideas that will spark some. I think we're going to move into conversation, but gratitude to Center A and the speaker series. Much respect to all the writers. And you can contact me through my website, or you can direct message me on Twitter. And that's the end of the slides. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Renee. That was so beautiful and moving. And I just thought that there was so much lived wisdom there, such as giving yourself permission to take up space, that I'm sure spoke to a lot of us writers and creatives in the audience. Yeah, and I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. And I'll remind our audience to please send in any questions or comments that you may have via the Q&A box or the chat. I'd be happy to read those out for you. Yeah, so why don't we get started with some just general questions about the project? I would love if you could take us back to the beginning and how you became initiated into this lifelong project. And I think there, in the presentation just now, you showed some really beautiful, haunting pictures of the cemetery and your own father's gravestone. And I thought that was just so touching, this idea of death as beginning, and grief as a portal. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I have to say, Coco, your questions are so deeply honoring. They're so thoughtful and multi-layered. So thank you. Yes. How did I get started with it? Well, I don't know. My friend might be listening. She's a fabulous friend. She's been there from the beginning. I remember the exact moment for this whole project. I was working on my first book, which isn't part of this. It was about a very traumatic subject. Children of Air India is about the bombing of Air India Flight 182 over 30 years ago. Everyone on board dies. And sadly, my aunt and uncle were on that. So I was working on that. And it was more traumatic, I think, now that I look back on it, that I even understood or appreciated. And to give myself some respite, I was out at my friend's place in South Surrey, and I was working at her table, and we'd go for these little walks, and I would talk to her about this other project, which I was doing just like for fun. You need to have a fun project. So it was an act of restorative self-care as an antidote to writing about trauma. And itself was part triggered by the untimely and, taking away of my dad, as I sort of feel. I feel he is present in another dimension. And so I turned to fantasy, like so many of us do, to world building, to story, to poetry. And there I was reading T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets and thinking about fantasy stories, feeling like I couldn't really own that in my literary, I was just starting out my literary career. So it was kind of a secret hidden pleasure, like eating chocolate. And that's how it all started. I just started doing free writing just to release my mind from writing these very serious docu-poetic poems. And I would just free write to, at random, I have the book over here. I won't pull it because it's under another stack of books, all dusty, but T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. And you can't get more high colonial English than T.S. Eliot, but I do love him. And so I was just responding, letting my subconscious do free writes to randomly chosen fragments of poetry. And that's where the heart of this journey bears all patterns comes from. That's where it started. And then everything started to flow. I really believe in that idea of the subconscious as a river. I think Jung has said, flowing through all of us. And it just takes a tap, right? And so that was the tap. Grief was the tap. Grief was the door, as you said, the portal. And the tap was my own sort of love of story and saga. And I had no idea where I was going with it. What I do remember is saying to my friend, oh, I'm not going to be able to do both of these at the same time. There was that sinking feeling. It was August and we were walking and I was like, I'm not going to be able to do both of these at the same time. So I set it all aside. It was just a fun little hobby. And I got working on the main thing, the literary career in the books. And then of course it just claimed me. Oh,
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so I think you mentioned a little bit about how it maybe you weren't exactly aware that you were writing like a fantasy, epic poetry, speculative fiction from the beginning, but that you sort of found your way into it. I'm wondering if there was a conscious moment where you realized, oh, these are the lineages that I'm writing from, and how was that experience? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think, it's a fabulous question. I don't think there was an aha moment, although there was one, which I'll get to. I think it was accretive. It was very much incremental, an accretion of things. I think further on, we might talk about this whole docupoetics and my use of texts and research. And my office, as people who have seen it will attest, I mean, I'm literally surrounded with boxes and books of text. And I do a lot online, but in the end, I have to hold the thing in my hand. So I do a little printing and I do recycle. But, you know, it's this idea that the stories started coming out of my imagination. And then I would go, wait a second, where have I heard this before? And of course, oh, my dad read me a fairy tale, or my mom told me this story, or oh, my aunties gossiped about this part of the Mahabharata, or oh, yeah, I saw this incredible Italian film on Ulysses with Irene Pappas when my parents were watching it. And I didn't really know what was going on, but they were so glued to the TV that, you know, it was on TV and stuff like that. So the Bible, you know, there's stories everywhere and they're all really kind of like fantasy literature. I mean, and I'm a person of faith, but whatever is your thing, whether it's history or faith, like there's stories are everywhere. And so I think it was an accretion and incremental. However, I will tell you this, when in the middle of the pandemic, I was working pre-publication with the publishing company to get the book together, right? I was like, you know, because people are always asking in the prep questions, well, who are your influences? And then I started writing down. And so on the website, you'll find a lot of influences listed, but it's then I started to really think in a more formalized way about Virgil and Homer and Chaucer and Shakespeare, certainly Milton for blank verse. I started to think about the alternatives to all the great man traditions and the women writers I've cited who are so dear to my heart. And I just started to tabulate and become more formalized about, well, who were my influences? But that definitely came after. Yeah.
Wow, yeah, fascinating. I would love to get a little bit into the book now and the project itself. So I know I sent you the questions a bit earlier. I'm sorry, there's so much quoting in here, but I wanted
it's fabulous.
Thank you so much. I wanted to bring this quote from art historian T.J. Clark, who has said that form is a way of capturing nature's repetitiveness and making it human, making it ours, knowable and dependable. And in the same essay, sort of contradicting that, he says, the point is that form repetition is change. So there's a little bit of tension there between control and change. So I'm wondering if you're wrestling with something similar with your own work, this oral tradition that centers repetition as a device, and it both acts as a container for world building and destabilizes that very world through its resistance to narrative. So yeah, what does the poetic form do for your storytelling?
Oh my God, I love it so much. I can first say, short response to that amazing question, which so gets me in my work, is that all of the above. Yes, yes, yes. And to take it just a step further, it's literally for me an act of time traveling. If I write a sonnet, I am literally, as a creator of color, and if I'm honoring the craft and practicing, and those of you who've been, you know who you are on this, who've seen me struggle with the sonnet and grow with the sonnet, you'll know what I'm saying, is that I am then reclaiming space for myself within the form and practice of a 1,000, but almost 2,000-year-old writing history, the epoch of which, the epic of which, you know, Petrarch and Shakespeare, of course, the apex of which is those guys, and how beautiful and fantastic. But that I too, in my humble way, can struggle along, and so that form becomes a way of claiming space. And there's an idea of apprenticeship, right? Which you see a lot in my work with Bramah and the Beggar Boy, that you pay homage to the makers and to the time and trouble and labor to build something that lasts. I also just wrote a few notes here that I think form allows you, as you have said in that wonderful quote and in your own gloss to the quote, to create these containers so that when you're working on something so vast and multi-layered, it finds a way of bringing things together. So 14-line sonnet mine in the book are quite densely packed, that you can say things without a 200-word expository essay, although sometimes the essay can work as well. But to go to your next point, which is so important, the destabilizing. So you create something and then you interrogate it, you destabilize it. Well, I think that is what separates the traditional, somewhat whimsical two-twee fantasy from a literary work. That's one of the defining characteristics, I think, of a literary work, that you recognize the implications of what you're doing and then you destabilize them in some way that has some integrity to the work, not just for the sake of it. I think then it becomes a nihilistic work, which I know is very popular in modern art, and I'm clearly not on that spectrum, although I take nothing away from the Dadaists and everyone else. But that for this work, it's making something that hopefully the grandchildren of the people who have bought the book will say, oh, read me again from Bramah and the Beggar Boy.
Wow, thank you so much. That was profound. And that also made me think about, I think it was Robin Wall Kimmer's work, in which she talks about origin myth as stories that, as you said, time traveling, that these are myths about where we come from that also provide a script for where we go from here. And yeah, that's really wonderful. And so I want to talk a little bit about thought J-BAP, this wonderful little phrase that you've come up with, which is so magical and spell-like to me. And it made me think about Joseph Campbell's notion of the hero's journey, which I think everyone learns about in English class. And there's a parallel arc, right, to this German notion of the Bildungsroman. And so the point is that all journeys can fit into a specific pattern of human spiritual development. And it is an Eurocentric colonialist idea. For instance, it's very troubling to talk about immigration in this framework. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, and specifically how your own project builds on, but also departs from this tradition.
Yeah, again, so thoughtful, so layered, so bang on. All of the above. And then to amplify that, the first thing I want to say as an immigrant settler is I've been very conscious that, Indigenous storytelling, from what I am learning, no expert, but what I'm learning from Indigenous craftspeople and makers is that it's not myth, it's not legend to them, it is historical oral tradition, and you don't mess with that. And I think I'm really conscious of that. So what I've tried to do, as I said earlier on, is as an immigrant settler, recognizing and dealing with the uninvited part, how do I also create a bit of space as a creator who's here for my work in a way that implicates myself and understands, or begins to understand, and wrestles with these very uncomfortable and there's a dialectic there, there's a struggle, there's a tension, as you say. So I think you already so beautifully expressed it. The thought J-BAP is an example of how I have layered throughout the text, hopefully again in a thoughtful way and not just for the sake of doing it, which becomes irritating in a long work, but in a thoughtful way, playing, undermining, subverting, reimagining language itself. Right? So the use of ballads and rhymes. I hope I don't take myself too seriously, but I'm a serious artist. I'm laying down my chops. Like I'm going out on a limb here, folks. Shakespeare, Homer, Chaucer, Milton. Milton's much on my mind because if the sort of poetics focus of book one was the sonnet, the poetics focus of book two is blank verse. So Paradise Lost, of course, and this idea of all the tropes that we take as normative are actually so Eurocentric and so gendered, and then how to mess that up. And I think if you start going through book one, you'll see that almost every aspect messes with, subordinates, interrogates, investigates, reimagines, reclaims, resists. It's endless, actually, and it patterned. And I'm just looking at my notes. Yeah, and this idea of the destabilizing hero, like, is Bramah a hero? She doesn't know that she's a demigoddess. She's beginning to get an idea because certain things seem to really work for her. She's a tradesperson. And she's a locksmith. She makes things. So I don't think she'd be very impressed with all this yakety yak I'm doing. You know, she's a woman of few words, a person of few words, and she's good under pressure. I'm neither of those things. And she is a kind of anti-hero, in fact, and deeply troubled about where she comes from and who she is, and not having all the answers, but everyone's always waiting on her in a Godot-like fashion. So, oh, I should stop there. So much to say.
No, thank you so much. That was really rich. And I thought that this would be a great place to talk about the role of craft in your work, since it takes up such a central place, right? Is this in Bramah, the Beggar Boy is this community of craftspeople, and the idea, as you said, of handicraft as lending itself to hope, and there having been this. Or the role of craft is having this practical and spiritual purpose in this dystopian world that you've created, which is bears some uncanny similarities to our own. And yeah, if you could just talk a little bit about the role of craft in how you've conceptualized it. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Center A is a place for artists. Much respect and honor to all of you. I've come increasingly, as someone who's not very crafty, not very good with her hands, to become absolutely obsessed with the idea that our survival resides not in thinking and doing, but in being and making. And we have to do that honoring that we are but one species in this ravaged planet, and we have to come to terms with not dominion over, but part of. And I'm really influenced in these ideas by the Irish maker who followed me on Instagram. I was so thrilled. Niamh McCann. I believe her first name is spelled in the Irish language, Niamh. You can Google her, but it's pronounced Niamh to rhyme with sleeve. And I have embedded that in the book in one of the characters. But she has this whole essay online called Making as a Form of Thinking. And if you've ever walked in, I've said this to friends, so I think some of whom are listening, if you've ever walked into a potter's studio or Center A, I remember different exhibitions I've gone to there, and you see the hours and hours that craftspeople and artists put in their work, usually for no hope or gain. Like most of us do not make a lot of money at what we do, but we are called to. I think it's one of your questions, you know, why do we do this? And that sense of awe, even grandeur, of someone who takes the time to build things right. And so often in our Eurocentric world, you'll see when people want to indicate that quality I've just said, they'll put European craftsmanship, European, like, you know, in the capital E, European, and full honor to that, but also that it's not just the purview of one class of people. And so that making with skill and care, and having a skill, knowing how to sew, knowing how to bake bread. I know one of my friends does, knowing how to grow food, knowing how to make glass, knowing how to make soap in a non-vaccine world when there's viruses, knowing how to sew masks when there's no vaccines. So I'm shaking my little finger. And that leads me to what I also wanted to do, and you'll see this destabilizing. I didn't want to over romanticize, because there's a lot of fascist literature about evoking the purity of the maker and the denigration of the intellect. Donald Trump did this all the time. These terrible freedom convoy people, I think they might see themselves, oh, we're resistors. And I'm like, no, this isn't about anti-science, far from it. And it's not about anger and the mob. This is about people who choose to collaborate and to make in order to survive. And it's become an obsession of mine, actually. And you know, I have to be humble from it, because I make with words. That's my making. And I think the Greek root for poet is poiein, and it means to make. So probably a good place to stop talking.
Yeah, no, that's super beautiful. I'm sure a lot of us could relate. I could certainly relate to that dilemma of what is the political value of words and how do I work ethically in that realm. And as you mentioned, I love that you teased out this nuance between, historically craft has been a devalued, undervalued, gendered form of labor that has not been recognized as quote unquote high art, right? But also that there is this folk romantic nostalgia that gets sometimes attached to this way of work. Yeah, and you just talked about that really beautifully. And I would, yeah, to bring up the question of why do we write as writers? I think I cited the Frank O'Hara poem again in my question, which is the poem called "Why I Am Not a Painter," which actually in the poem he does this clever thing by asking that question and then also collapsing the boundary between poetry and painting. So I want to pose that question to you, which is why are you a writer, and what is it about the medium or craft of writing or language that compels you to be a writer?
Wow, if only I could take you and keep you in a little bottle next to me. You're so thoughtful. Thank you for those questions. Thank you for referencing Frank O'Hara. Wow, just so lovely. Simple. I write to belong. It's taken me a long time to figure that out. I don't belong in this world if I'm not writing. I write to process and to survive. I can't survive without writing. I think of my dear departed dad in the very last days of his life here on this planet at Royal Columbian Hospital with a pencil and a paper. He had to, and he didn't even have the language to describe himself as a writer. But this idea that writing is an act of survival, and you'll find in my work, it's constantly referenced in different ways. And it's usually because, think of the material, people don't have pencils, they don't have electricity, they don't have inscription methods. There's always these ideas of finding fragments. In the very beginning, Bramah and the Beggar Boy find old computer disks and parchments side by side, right? So parchments, hailing back to vellum and manuscripts in the Middle Ages, and then computers and disks and so on. So this idea of writing as a way to survive and to belong in the world. I perform so well generally as an extrovert. I had to as the other, always traveling across Canada, east to west, always the first to say my name, to introduce, the burden, the exhaustion of that as an actual introvert. And so where I then process and sort of realign myself is when I go home and, write out my thoughts. Without it, I'm an unhappy person.
Wow, that spoke to me so personally just now, also as an introvert. And yeah, so I think now would be a really good time to just delve into the methods that you've been working with. And which is that I love when you read the beginning of your book, which is this process of coming into an archival document, right? And I love that the book actually begins with that. And you've been conceptualizing and working on this project since 2002, right? And so it's been 2 decades. I'm curious about your habits as a writer and how you managed to sustain work and interest in this project over such a long period of time.
I am so restored by your question. I believe my husband is in the kitchen listening, and he might be chuckling. Some days, this is the money quote, folks. Some days are better than others. And you know what it is? And I didn't know this when I was starting out. I had no idea. And like everyone says, if you knew, you probably wouldn't do it, right? Because it's terrifying hearing you say just how long it's been. I try and put that out of my mind. And as I get older, of course, the feeling of vulnerability, and as the world is in the time it's in, like, will I be allowed? Please, please, muses, history, God, if that is your belief, Buddha, everybody, will I be allowed to complete this? But micro steps, and increasingly going back to my cultural roots of yogic practice, practicing so that it doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to be perfect. It often isn't, but you show up, even if it's 1 word per day. And for those of you who are creators, writers, or want to be writers, or even just readers, this idea, not just readers, the most important part, but even if it's one word a day, even you touch the cards, you maintain good faith with your work and your psyche. So somehow, step by step, having a very supportive partner, which I do, thank goodness, having support networks around you, learning about self-care. So it's really very practical as a maker, like how to keep going. At some point during the writing of book one, I stopped moving my body completely. It was a heavy, terrible subject. I had to do what I had to do to get there, to get that book out in the world. I stopped moving my body, gained a lot of weight, got depressed. I didn't even realize all this. But what I have learned, right? Because you learn as a maker, if you want to keep making, how are you going to do it? I learned to sleep more on good days. Some days are better than others. Hydrate more, movement, and rhythmical movement. Where you kind of turn the brain off and maybe you're peeling carrots. If only I had one day when I retire, I'm going to like learn to throw mud on the wheel. Like the potter is a big symbol in the book, these makers. But doing rhythmic activities that are wordless really helps. So anything that embraces the practice, the idea of practice. Yeah, very practical answer.
No, I love that. I find that as writers and creatives, it's so important to build up that routine that as you said, there are good days and bad days, but maybe the point is that it is a baseline of something that we're always trying to return to.
Yeah, and I should add, just so it doesn't sound so didactic, just the joy of world building. I think if you've ever spent time at Comic Con or any of those things, any of the sci-fi people, the spec fic people, fantasy literature, we love world building. It's our release. It's how we belong. And so, yeah, it's the joy of it.
For sure. Yeah, so I think my final question for you right now is just going back to this question of docupoetics, which you talked about before, and I'll quote from your book, from the endnotes. You have this notion of docupoetics, the breaking apart of text to create new forms, often in combination of visuals, such as symbols and signs. I'm wondering if you could talk about what is at stake for you in this mode of writing, and if you conceive yourself as working in collaboration with your primary texts.
Yes, it's just such a fascinating and honoring question, and I thank you for it. In brief, it is about, I guess, summation of everything we've been talking about. It's how to reclaim space for myself as a person of color maker in these great traditions, to honor them, to apprentice to them, but then to muscle in, literally to muscle in. Docupoetics allows me to be both in collaboration and to be in resistance, that reword, to these traditions. I've never seen myself in them. And sometimes, as they say, you have to create what you want to read. You can't be what you can't see. And so going back to those mantras, and that I'm just looking at my notes, also sneaking in. So I think one of the ways that docupoetics allows me to do what I want with language is to invent new languages, invent a lexicon that has signs, symbols, chants, ballads, the high diction, the high culture, and the culture of the street of making graffiti. It's a whole other conversation, but we've been at it for a while, and hopefully we have some audience questions. So I'll pause there, but it's an amazing set of questions. I thank you. I want to hang out with you more, Coco.
Thank you so much. I want to hang out with you too. What an honor. And we do actually have a few questions in the Q&A box. Carla has asked, what are your thoughts on, quote, cultural appropriation?
Yeah, well, don't do it and try hard not to do it. It's very problematic. We have to try our best. We have to implicate ourselves. We have to be open to seeing, what am I doing and not doing? So I had to make the decision. I mean, I just feel sick to my stomach to think anyone who would take, for instance, First Nations myths. So you'll see right from the start, this legend I'm creating is very clear. It's about uninvited settlers. It's about settlers. And people have strong reactions to that word. It's interesting, and it is what it is. So these are about my characters are characters that I feel comfortable owning. They tend to be South Asian, not exclusively. One of my most beloved characters is the role of Dr. A.E. Anderson, who's based on a dear friend. I think she's listening. And she comes to a very tragic end, but she's a fabulous character. And she's at the heart of book one, really, in this parchment scroll in the archive that Bramah finds. So you have this tradeswoman, woman of color, person of color, finding an old scroll with her apprentice. And one of the major stories is a woman doctor who happens to be Caucasian and in a dystopian world. And that woman adopts a woman, a person, a young person of indeterminate background, and gives her her own name. So the doctor's name is Abigail Ellen Anderson. She adopts a street urchin, much like people do in India, and that street urchin becomes Abigail. And so having to reimagine these characters, I created my own culture. And I think this is what fantasy and epic literature allow us. But there's lots of stuff you got to be careful with. So I think you got to think it through, you got to feel it through, you got to be true to your work, but there's certain no-go zones. So one of my colleagues at SFU, Dr. June Scudelaire, says, because she'll often be asked this question at events we do, well, I'm a person of color, but I want to write from an Indigenous point of view. And she just very gently stops them and says, no. So I think that's the response there.
Thank you so much. Very good and concise advice. A comment from Jennifer. I'm struck by how your concept of, quote, micro-local is reminiscent of my own literary journal background, where Henry David Thoreau wrote, I have traveled a good deal in Concord. That attention to local details seems so relevant, especially now in the time of climate change. And she also says, thanks, Renee, this is so inspiring to reconnect with our traditional influences in our new way.
Oh, Jenny, well, thank you so much. That's so beautiful. And I love the quote by Thoreau. So there's another example, right, of a fabulous writer, sort of like great man writer, where if you think of the Thoreauian tradition of going very, very micro-local, right, or for poets of a certain generation like Gary Snyder, right, the real work. And so again, for those of us who are outside of those traditions, to find spaces for us to claim them. And particularly with the epic, there is so much literature about traditional literature about what is worthy of the epic. And of course, I wanted to totally destabilize that. Thank you, Jen. That's such a great question and comment.
Yeah, I also personally really loved when you talked about kind of being in the footsteps of these great English authors. And I found that so inspiring. Your just the like, I want to say audacity, but I don't mean that in a bad way.
No, I know, but it is, right? And you got to earn it. You got to earn it. And that I feel the burden of that. Like if you're going to lay down your markers, and sometimes you'll make it and sometimes you don't, but I'm just trying, right? So again, the idea of the practice where you can free yourself from, I don't have to be good as, dear Lord, that will be for others to decide, but I can try.
Yeah, totally.
I think as the song said, ain't no harm in trying.
Yeah. Our next comment from Rupa. This question is very interesting, and you said the experiences of hearing stories, fairy tales, little gossip, and other things that have inspired or influenced you. Do you note it down or write it out of memories that you have treasured or gathered and treasured in your mind? Yeah, I guess what is the process of working through those little fragments of sources that you have?
What a fabulous question. Thank you, Rupa, herself a wonderful creative. It's all of the above. I have so many, there's a file cabinet that you can't see, thank goodness, because it's such a mess, filled with the paraphernalia of a 10, 20-year project. So capturing little fragments on my phone as I walk, and then the drudgery of transcription, writing little notes in innumerable little notebooks and having to find the notebook, scraps of paper. And these are all these references to different types of fragmentary text are embedded throughout the work and kind of made very obvious in the title of the poem. So I'm trying to hint to the reader and the creators to think about methods of inscription and, as you say, being in the archive. But yes, Rupa, trying to capture. Those of you who see me in the morning, like my husband before breakfast, I have a little bedside notebook. I highly recommend it. And, I'll get an idea and it'll go in pencil. And the first thing before I do anything else, I write in that little notebook. And then remembering to go back to it is another thing. But yeah, all of the above.
Wonderful. And our next question from Rochelle, who says, Renee, thank you so much for your presentation. I love what you were speaking about on form and using classical Eurocentric poetic forms and blank verse masters like Milton. So these can be containers to recontextualize and reclaim your own story by subverting these known Englishy tropes. In my own writing, I'm often inspired by the poetic motifs in biblical verse and try to weave that into crafting my own narratives. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how or if faith and or spiritual text figures into your work, especially in relation to docu-poetics.
Wow. Oh, Rochelle, what a question. I honor all of the above. You and Coco, we got to hang out more. So those of you who are interested or come from backgrounds of faith, you will see much of that embedded in the language where I'm destabilizing, interrogating, not accepting, resisting, and also loving and celebrating, because that's my relationship to faith as hopefully someone with a bit of intellect, still recognizing the soul. So an example is the motto of the antihero, the locksmith, the tradesperson traveling through time, hooking up with seed savers and resistance fighters. Her motto is the sort of antithesis of stylish modernist nihilism. Her motto is let all evil, not capitalized though, not capitalized, let all evil die and the good endure. And certainly as the child of a United Church minister, you will feel much in the rhythm and the ballads used by the aunties who are very iconoclastic and are not into capital G male God at all, and very much matriarchs worshiping a mother goddess. You will find all kinds of play on everything that Rochelle so beautifully asked, and very dear to my heart. And of course, there's a central character along with Dr. A.E. Anderson, a South Asian woman named Auntie Maria, very much based on my grandmas and my aunties. And they smoke and drink and their masks don't properly cover their face and they're profane and they're survivors. Probably based, my mom would be horrified. She doesn't do any of those things, but she is a survivor. And so this idea of the aunties having a repository of maker knowledge that is very soulful and connected to the Earth Mother, Demeter, and all the Earth Mothers, the pre-male god, that is very much embedded in the work.
Thank you so much. I have no doubt that our aunties will save the world. I'm just going to put it out there. So I think a final question from the audience, James, who says, many people think of fantasy, less so sci-fi, as escapism and inherently conservative or even reactionary, like fascism and makers or nostalgia. You're obviously doing something very different. Is there a tradition in the genre you connect with your own approach? Or are you working against an existing tradition that has those traits?
Oh, James, thank you. Himself such a fabulous writer. So nice to have you here. What a wonderfully thoughtful, of course, question and multi-layered. I would say the latter, but it's a dialectic, it's a tension that I think we've been talking about throughout. And that re-prefix, James, is I think the way into my approach and my poetics, where I'm loving and adoring, never wanting to erase. That's not my game here. As someone who tries to be some sort of a feminist, and I say that because I don't think I ever live up to some of the sisters who put out there what it is. In our very woke culture, I'm always aware of how imperfect and broken and in need of healing that I am, and imperfect, right? And learning. So that tension between that very conservative, or the view of a very conservative literature dominated by, almost fascistic impulses. But I think folks like James are going to bust that open. So I think what's happened is you have traditions, you have epics. I'm right now reading 2 translations I highly recommend Maybe Coco, you can type them in the chat. Emily Wilson, I'll be teaching about this in the fall. Emily Wilson's newish translation of Homer's Odyssey, and Shadi Barsh, Bartsch from University of Chicago, I believe. Emily Wilson's new translation of the Odyssey and Shadi Bartsch's translation of Virgil's The Aeneid, from a very different perspective. So they're going back. These are women who read Greek and Latin and everything else. They go back to the ancient archives and they are rethinking that kind of veneer, like that veneer that gets built up on art pieces where you think they're all faded colors and actually they're these brilliant colors. And they scrape away generations of male-centered, Eurocentric, quasi-fascist, Tolkien, Eliot, veneer over Ezra Pound, dear goddess, let us not talk about Ezra Pound, who I adore, right? But really, look at his history of commenting on race in America. It's not good. So you go back and you scrape away all of that and you go to the ancients. So the importance of scholarship by scholarly laborers and workers like James, like the women I've mentioned, who are going back to the source and re-evaluating what these epics are. So I think that's a big part of my practice too, is pushing away the intermediaries.
Thank you so much for that. I think I missed a comment earlier from Jacqueline or Jackie, who says, I remember those days and conversations so well. I love seeing the journey continue.
Aw. Bless you, my friend. Very talented artist and writer in her own right. Thank you so much for supporting me. You need good people around you on the journey. And sometimes you don't have that, sometimes you're alone. And so sometimes you have to welcome yourself into these spaces. And it's just a hard truth. And I think all makers know this. There's the essential isolation of being a maker, even when we seek guilds and communities of practice, which turn up quite a bit in the book I'm writing right now in the series, book 2. Bramah's Quest, it's called. And I think it's slated to come out in the spring, if I can get it done in time.
Very exciting. And I think that sentiment of I love seeing the journey continue speaks to all of us here who we'll keep an eye out for your future work, and so excited for your upcoming releases and seeing how this journey unfolds. Thank you so much for everything today.
Thank you, Coco. Wow, I hope we will connect again. And fabulous questions, honestly.
Thank you so much. Now, yeah,
Henry, thank you both
if...
so much. Sorry, I interrupted. There is like a lag in the, sorry, go ahead.
No worries, just gonna turn it over to you.
Oh, I see. Thank you both so much. I was going to say, I think that it's really a stimulating conversation, and there's so many critical points that's just worth revisiting. And I'm glad that it's recorded, and then I will also send you a copy, Renee, and then I think that hopefully we can keep the conversation going. And it's just so great to hear more about what you're working on, and then sort of how your practice sort of evolves, and in terms of going different, explore different areas, and of course, Coco, I think that the question really helped giving us like a sort of holistic kind of view of Renee's work, and yeah, perhaps we should acquire a copy of the book and for our library collection.
Well, I'm going to be gifting you a copy, and maybe when that time comes, we can have tea and continue the conversation. And I want to give such a shout out, Henry, to the curatorial work you are doing with your team. Big shout out to Diane working behind the scenes today, to all the people who attended, the thoughtful questions by the audience and by Coco, and just a shout out to this speaker series and this whole idea of a mentorship program. Just wonderful, so needed, and it fits right in it's an enactment, it's a praxis of exactly what we're being talking about. So much gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much for the kind words. We definitely, it's part of our ongoing efforts really to hopefully to be a platform and also nurture younger practitioners in arts writing and also curatorial work, and also support artistic practices. So this is wonderful. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Because if not, I would, I mean, Renée has been really generously sharing time with us today, and then I would love for you to have a little bit break.
Thank you.
But
and it's wonderful that you recorded it, and wonderful that you sent me a copy. And with your permission, I am teaching a course at Kwantlen this fall, a special topics course on a lot of these things. And I hope to show them this recording, tell them about Center A. So in whatever way works that I can upload it to the course Moodle, that would be amazing. And yeah, be in touch with that. And I just want to thank everyone. It's a pretty glorious thing to be able to talk about one's work so thoughtfully with all of you on a Saturday morning. And yeah, hope everyone will enjoy the rest of their summer.
So wonderful. And if there are no other questions, I would like to wrap today's program, and I'm so glad we'll be able to be doing this. And I know there are some audience members who are tuning in from outside of BC, and thanks for being here. And also, just again, like what I said at the beginning, so gallery is open from Wednesday to Saturday, 12 to 6 p.m. And we currently has an exhibition called Banishing Act that includes assembly of artworks that explore queer artistic practices from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. So the show is on until the 1st of September. Yeah, thank you, Diane, for sharing the link. So please do come by to see a show before that, before close. And then after that, we will be having a new exhibition with Toronto-based artist at Pien. The exhibition is called Tracing Water. It's a fabulous collection of works ranging from prints, drawings, and videos that really explore water as a medium, a topical item, part of the form, and also content. So it's really exciting. And then we have a public reception on the 16th of September. So if you're in town, please do come by. It's 6 to 9 p.m. on Friday, September the 16th. And very lastly, if you would like to, we will have one more talk as part of the Centenary series, speaker series in September. So please do stay tuned. And if you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter, please, thank you, Diane, for the link, centera.org/subscribe. Well, thank you again, Renée. How wonderful. And then really, really enjoy how in-depth that we were able to go into the book and also your practice. And I saw that there are some of our arts writing mentees that joined today as well. And glad that they're able to hear this. And we're also sharing the recording with them so that if they missed today, and then they can revisit. And thank you, Coco. And I will see you when you come out of the office. we're literally just a wall apart. So thank you, Renée, and thanks everyone again for joining today, and have a wonderful Saturday afternoon and the rest of the weekend.